Good day and a warm welcome to the ENS Mining ESG webinar. I'm Ziggy Adonisi and I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion with distinguished speakers from across our offices in the continent. We will be exploring the S, which stands for social, in ESG. I'm going to introduce our speakers, but before I do so, I just want to give you some house rules. I will be posing questions to our speakers, and the participants are welcome to send through their questions during the discussion. There's a Q&A box, so you can put all your questions there. And at the end, we will then take questions. And then if we don't get through your questions, then we can email you directly. Thank you so much. Let's introduce Donald.
Thank you, Siki. My name is Donald Nyakairu, ENS in Uganda. I'm a partner in Uganda, and I mainly deal with energy, mining, and infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. Rachel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Dagadu, and I'm a partner in the Accra office of ENS Africa. I work in the finance, energy, mining, and infrastructure team. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. Stephanie?
Thank you, Nsiki, and hi, everybody. So my name is Stephanie Bush. I am a senior associate at the Namibian office of ENS, and I specifically focus on energy, project development, mining, as well as ESG and environmental law.
Thank you, Stephanie. Anthony?
Hello, everyone. I hope it's all clear now, yeah? My name is Anthony Gakuru, and I am a partner at the Nairobi office, focusing on corporate, commercial, mining, energy, and social governance.
Thanks, Anthony. Lastly, Zinzi.
Thank you, Nziki. Hi, everyone. My name is Zinzi Lawrence. I am a senior associate in the Johannesburg office at ENS. I specialize in mining and environmental law.
Thank you, Zinzi. To kick us off, so ESG is about human rights and equity. We will be looking at mining companies' relationships with people, as well as its policies and actions that impact individuals, group, and the broader society. The social element examines all people's interactions against principles of ethics, justice, and just their general well-being. This includes how a company treats its employees, its impact on its partners, customers, and other key stakeholders. It considers topics like working conditions, community relations, human rights, supply chain transparency, and more. ESG social performance indicators can include things like the health and safety of employees, labor practices of suppliers, diversity, equality. So it includes all social aspects. And the goal of these factors is to measure how well the mining company is meeting its human obligations in its operations and global supply chains and local communities. So ESG social topics may not be as easy to measure as your typical environmental or governance issues. But there are several trends driving how mining companies define and report on social impact to their stakeholders. So just to kick us off, ESG issues are increasingly gaining prominence across the globe. Generally, social factors in the mining context affects the lives of humans, local communities, health and safety. So why, Stephanie, and I'll start with you, why would you say the social is significant in the mining industry, the social element of ESG?
Thank you, Nsiki. And before I start off, I just want to say how glad I am that we are having a webinar that's specifically about the S, that S letter, because it's really been neglected in the ESG conversation. I mean, I know that myself as an environmental lawyer, there's a lot of dominance and like from an environmental aspect and the government's aspect, the conversation of ESG is always dominated by those letters. So just very happy to be talking about the social aspects. And I think especially in the mining space, the social aspects are so important because mining operations usually occur in very remote or can occur in very remote areas, far-flung. And it's very important for those mining operations to really connect and work together with the communities that call those areas home. And that's where we're seeing that mining companies are really focusing on the S factor because it allows them to obtain that social license to operate. Because at the end of the day, it's all about perception and wanting the local buy-in for the operations to occur in that area. And so whereas in the past, there was more of a focus on by companies to focus on measuring how much negative social impact they actually have, or having a once-off CSR project, or this approach of let's do as little harm as possible. There's now been a shift with ESG to really proactively adopt a human-centric approach and creating long-term social value. So this can be done, as you mentioned, by focusing on human rights, engaging very strongly with the local communities, understanding what are their concerns, what benefits do they still need, how one can interact with them, but also protecting their cultural heritage and ensuring a focus on health and safety, which is very important, equality, as well as including the community within the operation. So that's where we're talking about local skills development and local participation. So overall, the S and ESG therefore allows mining companies to really focus on fostering a sustainable social performance of their operations and thereby obtaining the buy-in from the local companies or communities for them to actually continue with their operations.
Thanks, Stephanie. Just to bring in the South African element, Zinzi, what would you say the S in ESG, what are you seeing is significant? Why is it significant in the South African mining industry?
Thank you, Nsiki. I think I echo what Stephanie has said, but as a starting point, I think we all know that, mining activities impact communities negatively and positively. On the negative side, you've got impacts that include displacement, resettlement, loss of physical and non-physical assets, and social structures. And then positively as well, mining operations create employment opportunities, enterprise development, skills development, amongst others. And so paying attention to the social component of ESG is important for securing the social license to operate. And generally, the social license to operate can be said to exist when a mining project is seen as having ongoing approval from key stakeholders, and that includes host communities, employees. And this is specifically important in the South African context because what we've seen is that host communities now have a heightened awareness of the obligations that are imposed on mining companies in relation to the social aspect. And in instances where mining companies don't comply with those obligations, or they don't have the buy-in of the host community and mine communities in general, we've seen a rise in protests, and that really is disruptive. It disrupts operations. It results in financial loss and production delays, and generally just a mistrust between the mining company and the community. Just 2 days ago, we're at the Junior Indaba, and the DMRE was just expressing how difficult it is to actually get host communities to buy into projects, and they've got approvals that they've given, mining licenses, mining rights, prospecting rights that they've issued, but the projects are not getting off the ground simply because of that social license to operate. And so that's why it's important to walk the journey with your mine community, host communities, and make sure that you've got their buy-in. Thanks, Nsiki.
Thank you, Zinzi. So the social element in ESG is not a new concept for the mining industry. What are some of the risks and challenges that mining companies experience relating to the social element? And I'll start with you, Rachel.
Thank you, Nsiki. I mean, the most prominent for us here is increasing and dynamic expectations, right? And in my view, that's the biggest challenge. And it's even more intriguing when we know that the concept of ESG itself is not a new concept, really. And for sure, some of us will understand if an executive of a mining company were to say, what's the fuss about all this? I mean, we've been doing these things from time immemorial. What's the new thing? And see, that's the challenge. Times have changed. And so the concept has also evolved, right? There's now a change in the nature of the expectation and a change in the sources of the expectations. And in the past, mining companies focused on corporate social responsibility investments determined by the mining companies themselves, right? Sometimes with the buy-in of the communities. And they were doing this to get what has now become known as the social license to operate, right? And past initiatives focus on minimizing the negative social impact of mining activities, causing less damage and avoiding attacks from host communities. But times have moved on and change has come. And now mining companies are called upon to create social value. They are called upon to manage the operations in ways that contribute to an overall societal net positive. And they must become a place where young professionals want to work. Now, all stakeholders, namely the investors, the shareholders, the financiers, the employees, potential employees, governments, regulators, local communities, really the society generally, expect mining companies to create a certain social value, which in itself is very subjective. It's very difficult to quantify and measure it. And coupled with this is an increasingly adaptive and dynamic nature of the expectations, especially from the host communities. And this makes it very, very difficult to achieve. It makes it very difficult to even target it. Okay. Now you can have an expectation that changes midstream, despite all best efforts of the mining companies. So let's give a Ghanaian context. Now, you can have a majority of indigents in Obuasi. Everybody would want to work for AngloGold Ashanti, but it's simply not feasible, right? But this expectation itself might change midstream to now require a more diversified workforce to sustain livelihoods. Now, many communities could wish that all their roads be tarred, and initially that's probably simply the expectation. But somewhere along the line, they're now going to wish for first-class roads, and they want these roads to be well lit. This may simply not be feasible. And unless there's that alignment of expectations and a well-thought-through strategy, which has the buy-in of the community, the positive effects of social value will simply not be realized by mining companies, no matter the percentage of their gross revenue that they dedicate towards societal objectives. And as you will imagine, the other issue that mining companies will need to grapple with is an increased cost in meeting these requirements or expectations. Now, the nature of the S elements of ESG, as we've discussed, requires significant investment from mining companies into the community. And it's not just in meeting the objective, but even in setting the objective, even in conducting appraisals to find out what initiatives can we do to be able to meet that social value, to be able to be called socially performing mining companies. Okay. For example, in Ghana recently, we have draft community development agreements, regulations, and this requires mineral rights holders to enter into draft community development agreements with mining communities and dedicate at least 1% of their gross revenue to development projects. And these projects have to be agreed with the community. And it's still in draft form. But when we spoke to mining companies, we realized that most of them are already doing in excess of 1%. because you have to do it to be able to get that social license to operate. And so, I mean, it's quite obvious that the dynamics are changing and mining companies are being forced to move with the change.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I just want to bring in Donald here just to hear the perspectives of Uganda. What are some of the risks and challenges that mining companies are experiencing relating to the social element?
Thank you, Ziki. And thank you to the previous speakers. I think the world has changed. The world is now one global village. So there's a great transparency, great awareness. And what happens in Uganda, for example, the same minute it's broadcast internationally. And if it's negative, the company that's operating a mine in Uganda would definitely be affected. So the world has changed. There's increasing pressure both on investors, in customers, and regulators to ensure that they are transparent in the mining operations they're doing within Uganda, for example. And thus, they have to take into account all the social elements of the people they are dealing with. And these are communities. And in Uganda, for example, we have communities in the Karamoja area, for example, who are artisan miners, mining at a small scale, but then a bigger mining company comes in to do more activity, bigger activity. Now they have to take into account the people they are dealing with. And they are not only dealing with the community, they are dealing with the employees, they're dealing with the government, they're dealing even with cross-border matters, because some of the operations are in a neighboring country. They're bringing in employees, they're bringing in foreign workers. And so the social element now is a big challenge for them, and the risks are very high. And they thus have to monitor it. It's become more important than actually the E and the G socially, because it can be a matter of life and death. Once the communities are not satisfied, there can be violence. There can be whole-scale violence, and it can lead to death. So these are now, the social matter now is a very important matter which has to be clearly taken into account when companies are advising their strategies. And I think it's also brought about by the social awareness and media. Media now, the media is very well linked with the local communities, with the world. And so the companies, mineral operations here are very highly monitored by the media, by the world. And as such, it's a big challenge and a big risk which has to be carefully handled by the companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. Stephanie, from a Namibian perspective, what would you say are the risks and challenges that mining companies are experiencing in your jurisdiction?
So again, I think in my jurisdiction, just given that we have this vast space, but so little people, the challenge that you're facing is that most of your mines will be in really remote areas, where the mining companies will then either have to consider, are we going to bus in employees or establish like a mining town? And usually they would then do the latter. But going ahead with that, it just comes major responsibilities, because you are essentially taking on the role of governing a whole town of people. So it might be the workers, but eventually also family members. And you would be established as accessory works, but that actually counts as service delivery. So you would have to be dealing with establishing electricity, bringing water, sanitation, and together with that, considering also social issues, just being there for the community in terms of having to prevent crime or other social abuse of alcohol or substances because there isn't enough recreational activities to do. So it's you're essentially taking on that role. And what's then to consider is what happens at the end of the mine. Will you then have just a stranded asset where then once the life of the mine is done and everybody then moves? Or do you find a way of reinventing that town and actually having somebody else almost take over that responsibility and perhaps even the ownership of the assets? And I see that very distinctly within the Namibian aspects, within this landscape that we have here. So just as an example, a few weeks ago, I was in Luderitz. So that's along our coast. I was attending a petroleum conference there. And while I was there, we visited a ghost town, it's called Manskupper, and it used to be a diamond town, and it was abandoned in 1956. And it was very interesting to actually go and you see these buildings and you understand that people lived decades here, and now it's just filled with sand and dunes. And interestingly enough, I even found a photo of my grandfather in one of the rooms. So, but it's very interesting then to see that and be like, okay, there was people that had full lives here. And then because the mine left, the operations left, where did those people then go? And comparing that, for example, with another town in Namibia, which is Oraniemund, which is also considering and really looking into how it can reinvent itself to from being a mining town to actually being like finding a different industry, so be that tourism or energy. And that is the social aspects that the mining company still has to envision, like what will happen after, even though it doesn't mean necessarily they have to take financial responsibility, but to understand what will happen after we are also done with the operations that we came here to do.
Thanks, Stephanie. So, I mean, mining legislation across various mining jurisdictions prescribes social development obligations and duties on mining companies. What benchmarks are being used to test the company's social performance or impact? Anthony, please let us know what happens in Kenya.
Thanks, Nteke. I think while ESG has been there for a long time, I think what people are grappling with is there sufficient regulation to govern ESG? And the most interesting thing from a Kenyan law perspective is we do not have a codified, sort of law which deals with ESG. So as a lawyer, you have to get into different pieces of legislation to find out what are the benchmarks, what are the parameters. And while everyone keeps on saying, ESG has been there for the longest time, we've been doing these things for the longest time, the law has actually not caught up with it in terms of, putting up proper principles in terms of what is this ESG, how are we going to regulate it? And that's one of the biggest problems we are facing in Kenya. So as a mining lawyer, you still have to go back to, various pieces of legislation to find out, how are we going to deal with the social aspects of ESG? And you'd have to dig deep into the Mining Act and find out what does it require a mining company to do in terms of local participation. What does the Mining Act require you to do in terms of community development? And you'll find some of these parameters, just deep in the act. And you're required, as a lawyer, as a mining company, to go into the act and ask some of these requirements. So some of the benchmarks in Kenya, based on various legislation will be, local participation. Are you allowing Kenyans to participate in some of these mining projects as far as possible? And where you can use Kenyans as opposed to foreigners, are you giving Kenyans that opportunity? Are there plans to develop the local community? Are you building schools? If you're taking up their land, are you replacing it with equivalent or better land? Are you providing schools? Are you providing clinics? How are you dealing with occupational safety and health matters? Yeah, especially for the employees and communities around. And for that, again, you would have to move into a different piece of legislation, to find out what are the laws in terms of occupational safety and health, and then find out the parameters there, and advise, your company in terms of how it's going to comply with the requirements under the occupational safety and health. You've got issues of diversity, gender, and for this, you'd have to, go back to the Constitution and find out, are we complying with the minimum requirements in terms of gender parity, in terms of diversification? So it's a balance here and there. It's not something which you will say, I'm going to a specific piece of legislation to find out what's going on. You have to, just dig deep into the various pieces of legislation. I think the only solidified legislation we have is from our both the Nairobi Securities Exchange, which has sort of put out, a guideline or a manual in terms of how you report your compliance with ESG. But then we've got very few listed mining companies, so they wouldn't be caught by that legislation in terms of reporting. And even the listed companies themselves, I think by the end of last year, it was about 15 out of 61 listed companies which had complied with the ESG, annual compliance requirements. So I think the law still has a catch up to do in terms of documenting your ESG requirements. And I feel that the sector is more driven by investors, who are coming into these companies and want to see proper ESG compliance. And on the other hand, driven by minorities who are actually quite active in terms of, pushing for their rights, despite, various mining projects which are going on in their areas. Yeah. So that's it. Okay.
Thanks, Anthony. Zinzi, if you look at the South African mining legislation, what benchmarks are being used to test the company's social performance?
Sure. So there are different laws, but specifically in relation to mining companies for the social component, the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act has a number of requirements that it imposes on mining companies for the benefit of mine communities. So, for example, mining right holders are required to compile and implement an approved social and labor plan. And this document really is designed to facilitate transformation at the community level and to ensure that, when companies reach mine closure, the host areas are not left with very marginalized economies. And these social and labor plans are reviewed every 5 years. So every 5 years, you've got projects that you need to do and get approval from the different stakeholders, including community members, the municipalities, and the regulator, which is the Department of Mineral Resources and Environment. Over and above this, mining companies are required to report on their level of compliance to the regulator. So they're required to submit reports to the DMRE, and then also to convene meetings with host communities to report on their performance in relation to the social and labor plan, which is a public document and is meant to be available publicly on the mining company's website. And then over and above this, we also have the mining charter, very controversial instrument, but it also sets targets, for example, for employment equity, including the representation of historically disadvantaged South Africans, which is a defined term in terms of the law. And then also we've got standards, such as housing and living conditions standards. We've got the mine community resettlement guidelines, and these are just standards and guidelines, and we still find that clients are not sure how they should be interacting with those standards. So those are some of the tools that are used to measure performance.
Thanks, Zinzi. Rachel, in Ghana, what benchmarks are being used to test the mining company's social performance?
Okay. So I was listening to Zinzi and I was thinking, do we have as many legislation on this particular topic? So in Ghana, we do have the minerals and mining local content and local participation regulations. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have some draft community participation agreement regulation that's currently in circulation. But across this, in Ghana, the focus for legislation for tracking this S has been on one, the ability of the company to create jobs. And when we talk about job creation, we're looking at three main criteria. We're looking at the use of local expertise, goods and services through the value chain of the mining sector. So it means sourcing and procuring goods and services locally and requiring subcontractors to source their products locally and employ persons from the local community in execution of contracts with a mining company. So one example will be that, let's say if a mining company were to give a contract to a person to develop the road in the community, it will be expected that that contractor will use local community, people from the local community to actually execute the project. So across the legislation, you will see this element of job creation in there. The other thing is on creation of employment opportunities for the local community in the mining company itself, okay? And here we are not looking only at unskilled labor. I think we've all moved away from that. We are looking at skilled labor and creating actual skill training opportunities for the local communities. And this could be through various means, scholarship opportunities, skills training programs, and succession planning. So if you look at the local content regulation, you see succession planning or succession plan being one of the sub-plans that needs to be included in the local content plan. In the legislation, you also find that you have to increase domestic businesses. You have to create an opportunity for domestic businesses to increase their capacity. And here the focus is not on businesses necessarily within the mining value chain, but across sectors, okay? So mining companies will be required to put in place measures to ensure development of other sectors, such as agriculture and services. And so I'm aware of some mining companies that have programs to provide capital to persons to develop oil palm plantations. And some of them have set up seed capital to give to persons who want to start a profession, such as hairdressing, dressmaking. And obviously, socioeconomic growth is better achieved when the economy is diversified, right? And mining companies are being required to actively assist the community, not to be over-reliant on the sector, especially as minerals are finite resources, and there definitely has to be life after the life of the mine. Now, in these legislation, you also find one element that's really, you see a lot being local participation and ensuring that there's some minimum equity participation of indigenous Ghanaians in the mining sector, okay? And this can be achieved through various ways, such as minimum local participation thresholds by regulators. However, outside regulation, mining companies can establish employee share ownership schemes and probably even free carried minority shares to the local community. And if you look at our legislation, you actually also have certain services or certain equipment that must be sourced from Ghana, including legal services, unfortunately. And then we've also mentioned the community development agreements. And as I said, this is something that Minerals Commission is pushing, okay? And earlier I mentioned that it requires mining companies to dedicate at least 1% of their gross revenue to development projects. And these projects must be ones that have been discussed and agreed with the community. It's not you decide and come and tell us, no, you need to discuss it with them and actually have an agreement. And if you look at the draft regulations, the areas, the things that the Minerals Commission is focusing on appears to be things like educational scholarships, apprenticeships, technical training, financial support for infrastructural development, assistance with small scale or micro enterprises, agriculture and product marketing, and some special programs for women and the youth. And you see that these elements run across the mining legislation in Ghana when it comes to the S. And so So that's something that is quite prevalent in Ghana, yes. But this is really just the minimum, and the community might expect you to do more. So it's just something that mining companies have to be aware of. Yes.
Thanks, Rachel. Stephanie, from the Namibian perspective, what benchmarks are being used?
Firstly, I'm so impressed by that entire list that Rachel just mentioned. There's just so many different measures which have been implemented there. Well, in Namibia, it is very much like to what Anthony mentioned. So as he was speaking, I was really very much, listening and also agreeing that that's very much on our side as well. So we don't have any particular ESG regulation or any kind of legislation in that regard. So you would be really piecing together from the different pieces of legislation and trying to see where that S component comes from. So in the mining sector specifically in Namibia, we don't have a mining specific local content policy or anything. So you would be looking at your Minerals Act, so that's the Minerals Prospecting and Mining Act. And within that, it sets out that the general condition of any mineral license will be that a mining license holder has to, just give preference to Namibian employees so far as they have the required expertise, but also to assist in developing skills of citizens. So it's a really qualitative approach to local content. So not quantifying and saying how much percentage needs to be there, but just giving that obligation on companies to try as much as possible to get where they should be going. In the mining license itself, conditions can also be included. So over the years, we've seen different conditions being included. More recently, what occurs is that if one applies for a mining license or any type of mineral license, and you receive a notice of intention to grant, that it will contain a requirement that a declaration be signed. And within that declaration, the mining company needs to then declare and say that they have to show proof that an X percentage of their management is previously historically disadvantaged Namibian. So sometimes that percentage is 5%, and also to show a certain percentage being held by a local Namibian. So that's more from that perspective. In terms of local communities, it then also requires the mining companies to show and put forward a strategy of how the company intends to address the government's intentions and objectives of poverty eradication. And it says to specifically benefit the Namibian youth and women, but from disadvantaged groups and what they say, the poorest of the poor. So there's then really that requirement for mining companies to, once they receive the notice of intention to grant, to put forward that declaration, and then they will be held to that declaration throughout the life of their mining license. And there is also provision made that if anything is misrepresented in that declaration, that the minister may immediately terminate the license. So from that perspective, we're seeing these S factors being more included, not through legislation, but through the conditions that are applied by the Minister of Mines and Energy when he grants the license. From a more general company perspective, ESG requirements are included within the NAM code. So that's our corporate governance code, which requires board members to have regard, for example, to social impact on communities while they are deciding on the operations of the company. So that's more than relating to fiduciary duties. Any company in Namibia would have to keep that in mind. But obviously in the mining space, that is also something very important to consider if you are a board member of a mining company, to keep those social requirements in mind and actually fulfill those.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, you can see the similarities between the different jurisdictions. So Donald, on your side in Uganda, how are mining companies being measured?
Thank you. I think it's the same as in Kenya and Namibia. There's no specific benchmark. We have a Mining and Minerals Act, which is which also has some requirements on social impact. It has a requirement that you must have a community development agreement with the community in which you're operating in. But it stops there in terms of ESG. There are other aspects, but you also have to dig around. In fact, the Mineral Act cross-references about 20 different acts. Companies Act, Health and Safety Act, private-public investment. It covers all those in references rather than having any direct standards in there. The Act also has some national content requirements. Recruitment, and you must have a recruitment and training and promotion plan. You must employ Ugandans. Priority of goods and services. Procurement must be those available in Uganda. The elements of technology transfer, research and training, but all these are monitored by the government, but there's no specific standard one has to benchmark against. I think what's happening is mainly the mining companies are mainly international companies, and they come with their own standards, and they come because they're some of them are listed companies, so they bring those standards and have to adhere to those international standards in locally, and that in a sense is giving a standard for the other local mining companies, and also is enlightening government regulators on what the standards are out there, and those are being now implemented and they're used as a benchmark for the mining companies. The other aspect is the benchmarks are also being set, it had been said before, by investors and by bankers. And internationally, those who are coming to invest here and do not want to be involved in international litigation and all sorts of sanctions against them because of their operations in Uganda. So those are the standards being used to benchmark against. Thank you.
Thanks, Donald. Now, just moving and to, drawing on the practical experience, please elaborate on how companies can incorporate the social considerations into the overall business strategy or decision-making. And Zinzi, I'll start with you, please, from a South African perspective.
Yeah, so there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It really depends on the mining company in question, and then also on the specific circumstances of the community in which the mining company will be operating. There's different considerations that apply, whether you're going to be operating in a remote area, urban area. We just recently have that judgment of the Constitutional Court, where the court has suggested that, mining companies require the consent of informal land right holders if they're going to be depriving them of their rights, before a mining right is granted. And so it's very important to know the area that you're going to be operating in. And then also over and above that, just understanding the social and economic needs of that specific community and assessing how the mining company can then assist. I think the unfortunate thing in the South African case especially is that host communities are often looking to mining companies, to take on responsibilities that, should lie with local government. And so it is important for parties to actually engage and consult. And that's why, we always advise our clients, you must go speak to your local municipalities, consult the integrated development plan to understand what are the needs of that specific community. And then also, consulting with the host community. And it's not just consulting with, traditional leaders. It's including everyone. I think we've seen that where you don't, consult, it can be fatal to your project. We've seen this in that case of sustaining the wild coast, versus the Minister of Mineral Resources. And so for us, consultations are absolutely critical. And again, there is legislation that tells us what exactly that looks like. It's not just a tick box exercise. So just coming back to your question, it really isn't a one size fits all approach. And we do advise that clients approach us, in terms of getting advice as to how best they can incorporate the social considerations into their business strategy as well. Thanks, Nziki.
Thanks, Nzi. Anthony, in Kenya, what would you say, how would you advise mining companies to incorporate the social considerations in their business strategy?
Surprisingly, on this one, I fully agree with Zinzi on the approach. I mean, it seems quite similar to what will happen in Kenya. I think for me, the four key elements in terms of what approach are we taking in terms of incorporating the S in the ESG into the mining companies. The first one will be, one, understand the various legislation which you will need your lawyers or your advisors to tell you, just like Donald and Stephanie have said, for us it's various pieces of legislation. So you need someone who guides you in terms of understanding what does the S mean for me in terms of the law, and then you'll put together what your legal requirements are, and then you will take an approach for compliance. The second point will be, similar to what Zinzi has said, and understand what your community is. What are their needs? How am I going to plug into this community? And for a country like Kenya, how you're supporting the community plays a lot in terms of the longevity of your business. How local entities take you, how local politicians take you, and you sort of want to avoid, lots of altercations with the community and with the local politicians, just generally with the government system. And so understanding your community and their specific needs allows you, to negotiate proper CDAs. These are community development agreements, and you'll be able, to be playing in the right space for the community, and they understand you, they know what you're doing in the community, and they will be able to move along with you. Then the third approach is lots of consultation, again, one with the community, but also consultation with the Ministry of Mines, consultations with various stakeholders. So that sort of allows you, to have an approach which has taken into mind the various players in the sectors. It's more of a collaborative effort in terms of getting your ESG done. And then the final one is your internal corporate governance principles. And I like what Donald said, because that seems to happen a lot in Kenya. You've got foreign companies coming in, getting in mining licenses in Kenya, and they've got their own policies in terms of, the social element. And so it's very critical that, from the company's perspective, your CSR, let's say, policy, your corporate governance policies, incorporate this social element from your get-go. And this will allow you, in terms of how much you can negotiate in terms of your consultation based on what you see yourselves doing, and therefore you're also not pushing yourself too much away from what your company generally does. So those for me will be the four key elements. Understanding your legislation, understanding your community, consulting, and also understanding your internal governance requirements.
Thanks. And just, yeah, so Donald, I think you can come in here from the Ugandan perspective.
Yes, I think what you need to do, and what we see companies doing, they're first doing a scan of the environment, and a detailed scan covering everything: environment, social, governance, politics, etc. And they then look at that study or scan and try and recognize the social issues that can come about as they're carrying out their operations. And they take a long-term view, not a short-term view. Take a long-term view, 10 years plus, on what the social considerations they have to take into account as they begin their operations, or once they've recognized the issue, then the next stage is to put in place appropriate policies. And most of them, as I've said, are benchmarking policies that have been tested elsewhere, because ESG social might be new here in Uganda, but in other places it's an old, it has been happening. So after setting policies in place, which are approved by the board, and they become a strategy of the company, they then put in place management systems to see and implement that policy, and see what is happening as they carry out their operations. At the same time, they're collecting data, and that data will form the basis of their reporting. They might be reporting to the ministry here, the government here in Uganda, or they might be reporting to financiers or other foreign entities which are monitoring them too. And so these are the steps which I see mining companies are adopting here in Uganda to ensure that they are compliant with ESG principles. Thank you.
Thanks. And Stephanie from Namibia.
So, I mean, so much has been said already, and I completely echo all of those sentiments that it is important, consider your legislation, the local needs. Is the nearest community nearby? It doesn't have electricity, it doesn't have a school. So to actually pinpoint those needs and address those. What I also think is very important is just to really integrate social performance and these social issues from the onset in your business plan. Just as much as now, from an environmental perspective, companies are from the get-go integrating circular economy into their business plan. It's the same with the social. It's like really understanding that the social performance of the company is an integral part of that company's success. And we have a great example in Namibia of a mining company that really has done so much over the years in terms of the social aspects and just how it's actually involving the country. So it's involving government, the media, the local community, and has always doing the most amazing things. And that company itself has such a great brand within the country and has literally that social license, not just in the community, but throughout the entire country. And it's just like seeing and recognizing the benefits that's just working very closely with the social beings that are around you, the social communities, what aspects and what benefits that can bring to the company from the get-go. And I think that's always very important, to literally start off with thinking that as you're preparing your business case for the country.
Thanks, Stephanie. Rachel, just close us off on this question, please.
So when everybody was speaking, I was like, okay, I hope Nsiki doesn't come to me because everything has been said. But anyway, so one, I think that there's a need for a good understanding across the entire organization of the underlying concept of social performance. Okay, a good understanding of the recognition that social performance of a company and the creation of a resilient community is directly linked to financial performance of the organization. in the short, the medium, and the long term. That understanding has to be there, okay? Because the sustainability of a business and the creation of successful outcomes for the business, for the shareholders, for the entire stakeholder group is directly linked to the social performance of the organization. Okay, now it's very important that directors and management understand and appreciate these concepts, but it is particularly important that everyone in the organization, all the way down to the person at the executive posts, understands the role of social performance in this business. They have to understand it. And in this age of social media, the effects of bad publicity of a company's underperformance when it comes to its social targets on the share price of the company, on the stock exchange, on the company's ability to attract capital, renew its licenses. These things cannot be overemphasized, okay? And the company also has to do some very good analysis, social impact analysis, so that you know what are we trying to achieve. Everybody has to understand it. Last thing I think Zenzi mentioned, it is communication, okay? We have to get to a place where we are communicating with the community. We are building a partnership. We are not just telling them things, building a partnership that involves them, and that involves them also in the implementation of whatever strategy that we are working together with them to build.
Thank you very much. I see we are running out of time. We literally have 2 minutes. So I'm just going to check on the Q&A. So participants, if you have specific questions for any of the speakers, please do put it in the Q&A box. And if we don't answer today, we're also happy to send you an email. So I'm just going to check what questions we have. Okay, I think this one is for you, Rachel. What is the assessment of the positioning of mining companies in the various jurisdictions with regards to social performance? Is it more voluntary or more for the purposes of taking compliance with the law?
I think that the mining companies moved away from regulation to it's no longer about regulation. It's they now do these things not because there's somebody, a regulator with a cane behind their backs. No, it's because they need that social license to operate. And that social license comes from the people, doesn't come from the regulator. So you have to work hand in hand with the community to ensure that you keep them happy and you're actually creating a social value. And I don't think mining companies recognized this when ESG became prominent. They recognized these things a long time ago. There's more noise about it, and probably more smaller mining companies are now doing or looking up to the Anglo Golds and the Gold Fields and the Newmonts. But I think they moved away from just satisfying the regulator to doing the right thing a long time ago.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And just to close us off, I mean, what would we say is the ENS's approach to supporting its clients in dealing with the social component of ESG? Anthony, let me just close us off, please.
Yeah, I'll try and make it short and brief. From a Kenyan law perspective, again, because we say, the legislation is in all manner of places. How we help the clients is, to put this legislation together into a manual, and it will have all these requirements under your Mining Act, under your Employment Act, under your Constitution. And it just gives you a good reference document or a Bible kind of a document which you can go back every now and then and confirm what will this requirements in terms of my social compliance be. The second element is we conduct a lot of training, again, because of the different pieces of legislation, get into the mining companies and try to educate them what are the requirements, what are the compliance requirements, what are the filing or annual return requirements, how do you position yourself with the community, who are the best people to engage with in terms of government or other stakeholders. So it's a whole raft of training going around. And then the third part is we're quite keen in terms of the agreements we negotiate, and we help the companies negotiate. we try to make sure, the CDAs are not just, compliant for the purposes of compliance with the Act, but they actually have, provisions which translate to the social aspects of the community and which are tangible and can be verified by the various, regulators in terms of finding out whether you have complied with the various, social requirements under our Mining Act. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and to the entire panelists. This has been really informative, and I hope all the participants have taken something from this discussion, which is very important. And should you have further questions, please do send us an email and we'll be happy to respond, because I can see we haven't gone through all the questions that we have received in the Q&A. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thank you.